Have you ever wondered how a country founded on revolutionary passion and socialist ideas could rise to become a global powerhouse, only to collapse just as dramatically? From its beginning in 1922 to its end in 1991, the Soviet Union's history is a story of ambition, difficulty, and significant changes in world politics. In this video, we delve into the main parts of this grand tale, from Lenin's strengthening of power to Stalin's harsh industrialization, and from the victory of World War II to the tense standoff of the Cold War. Come along as we examine how internal challenges and external pressures ultimately led to the downfall of one of history's most powerful empires. Russia's history from 1922 to 1991 is mainly the history of the Soviet Union, also known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Established in December 1922 by the Russian Communist Party leaders, this union was founded on ideology and roughly coincided with the Russian Empire. The Russian SFSR, the Ukrainian SSR, the Belarusian SSR, and the Transcaucasian SFSR were the four component republics of the newly formed nation at that time. A federal form of governance based on a series of Soviets founded in villages, factories, and towns in larger districts was established under the 1924 Constitution. The All-Union Congress of Soviets was the apex of this pyramid of Soviets in each of the member republics. However, although the Congress gave the impression that it possessed sovereign authority, in reality it was ruled by the Communist Party, which was commanded by the Politburo in Moscow, the Soviet Union's capital, just as it had been during the rule of the Tsars prior to Peter the Great. War communism and the new economic policy. War communism refers to the period from the time the Bolshevik Revolution was consolidated in 1917 up to 1921. Banks, railroads, and shipping were taken over by the state, and the money economy was curtailed. Strong opposition soon developed. The peasants demanded cash for their produce and did not like the fact that they had to give their extra grain to the government for Civil War purposes. When the peasants revolted against the policies of war communism, Lenin started a process of gradual withdrawal from such policies through the introduction of the New Economic Policy, NEP. The peasants were relieved from the forced deliveries of grains and were given the freedom to sell their produce in the market. Trade was encouraged by allowing private business and retail. The state remained in control of banking, transport, industries, and public utility sectors, while the left opposition within the communists condemned the rich peasants or kulaks who benefited from the NEP. The program was highly beneficial and the economy improved. The NEP would later face growing opposition from within the party after the death of Lenin in early 1924. Changes in Russian society. In the period of Stalinist transformation in Russia between 1929 and 1939, changes were not only in the economic sphere but also in the social and cultural aspects. Since the beginning of the revolution, the government sought to undermine the power of men in families. Marriage was liberalized through easier divorce procedures, and women were freed from their roles of childbearing through legalization of abortion as early as 1920. This emancipation opened up employment opportunities and made girls go to school and work in factories or offices. Child care centers were created for children and young ones, and social functions were moved from homes to educational and recreational groups, such as Soviet. The regime also changed the policy of Tsarist Russia in discriminating against national minorities and included over 200 minorities in Soviet society. Medical services were developed with campaigns against diseases such as typhus, cholera, and malaria, which resulted in the growth of the number of doctors and the reduction of infant mortality rates and life expectancy. The government encouraged atheism and materialism, according to the Marxist theory, and suppressed the religious organizations, especially the Russian Orthodox Church, which was part of the pre-revolutionary structure. Priests and other religious leaders were expelled, and party members were banned from worshiping. The education system was secularized, and the church lost its control over education. Religious education was moved to homes, while atheism was promoted in schools. In the midst of these social and cultural changes, Stalin's economic policies of industrialization and collectivization of agriculture transformed the nation. The first five-year plan centralized the economic control, which increased the heavy industry, but created havoc in the agriculture sector due to the forced collectivization that displaced millions of peasants and caused famine. Stalin's consolidation of power was characterized by repression, eliminating political rivals through killings and sending them to the forced labor camps of the Gulag. This period witnessed an enormous growth of state power and repression for the opposition, which exceeded the measures of the Tsarist government. Cold War. The cooperation of the leading allies that led to the victory in the war was supposed to define the process of post-war rebuilding and peacekeeping. However, the conflict of interest between the Soviet and the U.S. national interests led to what was termed as the Cold War, which was a political rivalry on the international level, with the two superpowers presenting themselves as representatives of two different political systems in the world. The Cold War began in the aftermath of the Potsdam Conference in 1945, when Stalin and U.S. President Harry Truman had a disagreement over the fate of Eastern Europe. Stalin wanted to have a buffer zone of states between Germany and the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had been invaded before. Truman said that Stalin had violated the Yalta Agreements. Eastern Europe was occupied by the Soviets, and Stalin was secretly working on his atomic bomb project, which further increased the tension. In April 1949, the United States created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a defensive pact in which member states agreed to defend one another against aggression. In response, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact in 1955, an equivalent alliance in Eastern Europe. The division of Europe into the Western and Soviet blocs soon spread worldwide, especially when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949 and backed communism, such as in China. Soviet foreign policy aimed at increasing security and managing Eastern Europe. This control was achieved through actions such as the suppression of the Hungarian Uprising in 1956, the suppression of the Prague Spring in 1968, and the support of the suppression of the Solidarity movement in Poland in the early 1980s. However, as the Cold War unfolded, a new phase of relations in the 1970s became more multifaceted. The bipolar world order was no longer a reality, and the Cold War was over. The less powerful countries got more freedom, while both superpowers tried to curb the spread of nuclear weapons through SALT I, SALT II, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union deteriorated further after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, who was an outspoken anti-communist. However, relations improved as the Soviet bloc started disintegrating in the late 1980s. The Soviet Union lost its superpower status that it had attained during the Second World War in 1991, the Khrushchev and Brezhnev years. After the death of Stalin in 1953, a succession crisis began within the Soviet leadership, and Nikita Khrushchev came out on top. In a speech delivered at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956, Khrushchev criticized Stalin's totalitarianism and the personality cult. This speech was a turning point as Khrushchev began to make changes to the system. These reforms changed the emphasis from large-scale industry to the manufacture of consumer goods and housing, and the increase of agricultural productivity. These policies enhanced living standards, but the scarcity of appliances, clothing, and other goods emerged as a long-term issue. The judicial system, while still controlled by the Communist Party, changed from the previous police terror regime and allowed for more freedom of thought. Khrushchev was overthrown in 1964 by the Soviet Union's Central Committee due to mistakes such as the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Sino-Soviet split. Following this brief period of collective leadership, Leonid Brezhnev, a bureaucrat by training, emerged as the leader. However, Khrushchev's attempts at economic liberalization did not go far enough, and the Soviet economy remained highly centralized and planned without much reference to market forces. By the 1970s, the USSR, as an industrialized country, could not maintain the earlier high growth rates. Growth was capital and labor-intensive, and both factors of production became expensive, partly because of the focus on the production of consumer goods. The goals and objectives formulated in the 1970 five-year plan were not achieved, and the agricultural sector did not receive much attention during Brezhnev's rule. The 1960s and 1970s saw a rise in the availability of some consumer items, but there was little progress made in the areas of housing and food supply. Alongside the shortages, a culture of materialism developed, which fueled the rise of the black market and state property theft. In spite of these obstacles, the Brezhnev period Soviet leadership was resistant to major change, exhibiting a conservative outlook that was in stark contrast to the revolutionary zeal of the Soviet Union's early years. With Brezhnev's passing in 1982, a period typified by resistance to change came to an end. Breakup of the Union. The Soviet Union's political and economic systems appear to be disintegrating more and more, and haphazard attempts at change to stop this process dominated the decade that followed. Subsequent to the swift ascent of Brezhnevite transitional leaders, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was comparatively youthful and dynamic, brought about notable transformations in both the party hierarchy and the economy. Following decades of official persecution, its Glasnost program liberated the public's access to knowledge. However, Gorbachev did not deal with the fundamental instability of the Soviet system, and the Soviet Union was on the verge of disintegrating by 1991, when a scheme by government insiders exposed Gorbachev's political clout. After the World War, the Ottoman, Habsburg, and Romanov empires disintegrated, and Eastern Europe and Eurasia were destabilized. Only the Russian Empire was transformed, and this was done by the Bolsheviks. It was led by Stalin through industrialization and the Nazi invasion to emerge as a superpower that could compete with the United States. But the Soviet Union remained in essence an empire, united not by a czar, but by a party. The command economy was increasingly ill-equipped to deal with post-industrial technologies and with the needs of the new industrial middle class and well-educated bureaucracy that the command economy helped to create. Perestroika of Gorbachev meant dismantling of the economy, and Glasnost let ethnic and nationalist discontent come to the fore. In attempting to reform the party, Gorbachev undermined the ties that bound the state and the Union together. The development of the Russian Republic in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev has blamed Boris Yeltsin, his former opponent and the first president of Russia after the Soviet Union's collapse, for dismantling the country for his selfish motives. Due to the fact that Russians were the leading nationality in the Soviet Union, few people paid much attention to the difference between Russia and the USSR before the late 1980s. However, the fact that the Soviet regime was dominated by Russians did not necessarily mean that the Russian SFSR benefited from this state of affairs. In the Soviet Union, Russia did not even have the meager. Next month, he succeeded in getting legislation passed that withheld two-thirds of the budget and gave precedence to Russian laws over 1991. The final act in the transfer of power from the Soviet Union to Russia was the delivery of briefcases holding codes that would launch the Soviet nuclear weapons from Gorbachev to Yeltsin.